was East Germany, Northern California was West Germany. East Germany was controlled by Russia. Now, Russia is a socialist country, it's a communist country, so all the laws and things that happened in East Germany were reflective of communism and socialism. What I'd like to do this evening, and hopefully I'll keep you awake, is tell you briefly what it was like to live in East Germany. And then I think you'll catch on very quickly that it was pretty bad. My mother and I, we escaped from East Germany, and it was very tricky to that escape. So I hope you'll listen for that. And then we immigrated to America. We got on a boat and we immigrated to America, maybe like some of your ancestors in your past have immigrated to America on a boat. And I will tell you what I found here in America. And then if everybody is still awake and interested, and if there's some time left, I'll tell you what happened after I went back 50 years later to East Germany, never having been back since then. So that was in 2009. Well, Russia was a socialist, communist country, and East Germany was also ruled by socialism and communism. Let me try to describe what that is like. First of all, you have almost free housing under communism. You also have free education. You have free medicine, medical help. You have free childcare. So far, that sounds pretty good, doesn't it? You also get free vacations. Most of them are paid for by the government, and they bus you wherever you need to go. But there was a catch. And the catch was that everything in East Germany was owned by the government. Everything. Housing, medical facilities, factories, everything, schools, everything was owned or operated by the government. Now, in East Germany, everyone was expected to work. That means mother and father were expected to work 8 hours a day or more. And the children went to free childcare. And during that free childcare, they were raised properly under communist theology. Communism decries families. They don't want family centers. They discourage that, and they typically try to break up families. So they made everybody work. The government also controlled what books you could read. How many here have read Uncle Tom's Cabin? Anybody? A couple of people? Uncle Tom's Cabin was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe in the 1800s, and she described the deplorable conditions the blacks lived in America, in squalor. They lived in squalor here, just having been freed from slavery, but they still lived in squalor. And Uncle Tom's Cabin was a mandatory book to read in East Germany because we were told that this is how life is in America, throughout America, that everybody was very oppressed and poor, and what we saw otherwise, commercials and so on, was all propaganda, false propaganda. We were also restricted as to what we could write. If you wanted to write a play or a poem, and it didn't agree with the communist theology, you were forbidden to write such things. You were also told how to write. For example, I started writing with my left hand when I started school. The teacher would tear everything up that I wrote until I learned how to write with my right hand. All good communists would write with their right hand, so I learned how to write with my right hand, but I throw the ball with my left hand. You were also restricted where you could travel. For example, going from Southern California to Northern California, you were forbidden to go to Northern California. You were simply forbidden. You couldn't go to Nevada. You couldn't go anywhere else. You were simply forbidden to go outside of East Germany. You were told what kind of movies you could watch, what kind of music you could listen to. Any rock and roll or Western music was strictly forbidden. The news, it was government news, and you would listen to that and nothing else. There was very restricted news. If you wanted an appliance like a television or a car or something like that, refrigerator, you would have to appeal to the government to get that. My wife had a friend there. Was a lizard. So you had to get special permission from the government to buy those things. The food that you could buy was restricted. You would get food stamps, and you could only buy certain amounts of certain things. Going to church was forbidden. You were forbidden to go to church. So you might say, well, what if you didn't obey those things? You know, what if you decided to go to a church? Well, there were people watching you all the time. Your neighbors were encouraged to watch you. Children were asked at school what their parents were doing. There were spies everywhere. Everybody was under surveillance, more or less. And if you broke any of those laws that were given, guess what would happen? Maybe the child care that you normally would receive would be of lesser quality. Or the education, and in a little while we'll see what would have happened to me. Education would be restricted. Instead of going to high school, you would no longer be able to go to high school. Medical, there was a lot of control over medical services that you needed and that you wouldn't get if you didn't obey all the laws that the country put down on you. So housing was another one. If you were not obedient to all the laws, instead of living in a comfortable home or apartment, you would be restricted to go somewhere else. And there's nothing you could do about it. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. You couldn't, if you spoke up against it, it would get worse and worse. People generally lived in constant fear. They were fearful of their neighbors. They were fearful of what was called the Stasi, which is a police, secret police in East Germany. They were very, very fearful. There was no hope. People didn't have hope. Could you imagine not being allowed to go to church? I mean, right now we're not allowed to go to church, so this is somewhat reminiscent. But at least we know that as soon as this pandemic is over, we can go back to church. People were hopeless and in great despair. As a matter of fact, many people ended their lives. They were so frustrated about it. Well, let me talk a little bit. So this kind of gives you a picture of what things were like. Very oppressive, very, very oppressive. Our family had a dream of going to America. But in 1955, that dream vanished when my father died of a very tragic death. Now, in 1956, my sister was 16 years old at the time, and she wanted to go to West Germany. So my mother tried to sneak across with her. They left me behind to avoid suspicion that I would be going with them. So I was staying at a neighbor's house, and my mother and my sister, they slowly worked their way to the East-West German border. Okay, that's maybe going kind of like to St. Louis Obispo, you know. And then they were going to sneak across the border. So they got to the border and they tried to sneak across and they were caught. Now, punishment was usually very severe, but here was the 16-year-old girl with her mother, and instead of punishing them, they just captured them and put them into the barracks with the soldiers overnight. And in the morning, they told my mother and sister to go back to where they came from, back to East Germany. And so my mother did, but a little bit out, she'd made a U-turn, and there was a forest, and she went into the forest. And of course, the soldiers were watching them, and when they saw that, they started shouting and screaming after them not to do that. But she did it anyway and started running, and they started shooting at them. And so they were being shot at, but miraculously, my mother and my sister made it across the border in the forest, and there my mother stayed with some friends for about 2 weeks, and then she said goodbye to my sister. Now, she was 16 years old. I don't know how many of you are 16 years old. My sister was going to be in a strange country with people that she didn't know, and her mother left her because my sister didn't want to go back to the East. So my mother came back without my sister. Well, you can imagine what the police did. They started interrogating her for days and asked, why didn't your daughter come back? And she said she didn't want to. And she just insisted on that. At that point, we became ostracized and called traitors because my sister left the country. So the punishment for that was my mother was assigned very, very heavy duty work. I would have gone, I was about 13 or 14 years old at that time, or a little younger, and I was told that when I graduated from grammar school, I would not be allowed to go to high school, and I would go into an apprenticeship of some sort when I was about 14 years old. So the government knew exactly what to do, how to punish people. My mother was given a mark on her passport, and she was told that if she would ever come within 20 kilometers or 15, 16 miles of the border, she would be arrested and would be taken to jail. And we know of other people that were not only taken to jail, but they were transported into Siberia, into the gulags in Russia, which were extreme, harsh jails. Many people didn't survive those. So she was told, made very, very clear that she was not allowed to go anywhere near the border or she would be punished and arrested. I would be taken into a where people without parents go, orphanage, and properly raised by the communists. So on December 24th, 1959, I was playing with my friends downstairs, and we lived in an apartment, a very small apartment. And I came up for lunch, and I noticed a suitcase on my mother's bed. And my mother said, why don't you put a toy, one of your favorite toys, in the suitcase? Because tonight we're leaving. We're going to escape. And I said, Mother, we can't do that. You know, I knew what the punishments would be. And she said, don't worry, I've taken care of everything. She also told me to go back downstairs and not say a word to any of my friends, but say goodbye to them. So I did. I said goodbye, and I put a little train set in the suitcase. I still have it. I didn't let my son play with it because he all just wanted to make it crash and break it. So later on, I still have that one. We were very much afraid of neighbors watching, but Christmas, very few holidays, Christmas Eve, that the communists couldn't control very well. People had their Christmas trees, and people decorated them and celebrated the birth of Christ in their own homes. So when it got dark, my mother took the little suitcase. We went down on the back, outside the back of the building, the alleyway, and we walked about 2 blocks to a streetcar. We got on the streetcar, and the streetcar took us to the nearest town, which was Leipzig, Germany. And from there, we took a train, which took us to Berlin. Berlin is the capital of Germany. Now, Berlin was just split in two like the rest of the country. But Berlin was surrounded by East Germany. Berlin is surrounded by East Germany, so it's kind of like a little island. And we went to the east portion of Berlin. West Berlin is controlled by Americans. So if you made it somehow to the west, to West Berlin, you would be free. And we got on a subway, and this was all timed very, very carefully so that everything would just work like clockwork, because we knew that neighbors could potentially watch us and see us leaving with a suitcase and report us. So my mother had planned everything very, very carefully. She had also, and I won't go into details on this, but she had forged her passport very carefully. She didn't know what the mark was in her passport, but she, in a clever way, figured out a way of getting the mark out of there and getting a new passport without the mark. She was hoping the mark wouldn't be in there. So we got on this subway. Now the subway made a sort of a circular loop in Berlin. The first few stops were in East Berlin, and then there was one stop it made in West Berlin. And then it went on and made several more stops in East Berlin and came back to its original location. We bought a ticket way in East Berlin with the intent of getting off on that one stop. Now that one stop was controlled very carefully. So when my mother got onto that subway, she was obviously closer than 20 kilometers to the border. And if her passport had that mark in it, it would have been the end. The risk that my mother took, I didn't really comprehend this until much later, until I had children of my own, just the risk that she took. But she got on that subway, and the subway moved, stopped in the various places on the eastern sector of Berlin, and then it made the stop before the western stop. When that happened, the doors opened, and there was a Russian soldier that came on board in the front, and in the rear they had machine guns, and then there was one sergeant, Russian sergeant, that came along, and he checked everybody's paperwork. There was a young couple, maybe in their 20s, sitting in front of us, a few seats, and the Russian soldier interrogated them, looked at their paperwork, and gave back the papers. The young couple sighed with relief after the Russian soldier passed. And the Russian soldier mumbled in Russian, "I wonder what they're so happy about." And he looked at me while he was mumbling that. Well, I spoke fluent Russian at that time. It was mandatory in school, so I understood exactly what he was saying. And he said, and he could tell I understood. He said, "Baruski." I said, "Da." So he knew that I spoke Russian. Now, my mother had told no matter what happens, not to say a word, that she would do all the talking and she would do everything. And she held my hand, and when I said da to the, which means yes, to the Russian sergeant there, I could feel her hand squeezing my hand. And she was kind of turning white, and he started telling me in Russian, I wonder what this couple is so happy about. And I responded in Russian, I don't know. And then he said, well, we need to find out. He pointed to one of his soldiers, and he escorted that couple out. They never came back in. Then he walked closer to my mother and asked for the paperwork, and she gave him the paperwork, and the tension was just unbelievable. And he continued to speak to me in Russian, and I told him that I had a pen pal in Moscow, which I did. I communicated with them, and that I learned Russian. He complimented me on how well I spoke Russian, and eventually he gave the paperwork back to my mother. He either didn't see the mark or it wasn't there. And he interrogated a few more people, and then the Russian soldiers left. The doors closed, and the train moved on. And in a few minutes, it ended up at the other station, and the doors opened. My mother waited until the very last minute because frequently there were spies and secret police on these trains that would stop people from getting off where they were not supposed to get off. She waited until the very last, grabbed the little suitcase and grabbed me and ran out the door before the doors closed. We were in West Berlin. There was a little kiosk that sold newspapers and eating, little snacks. And I stopped my mother and I said, I want to buy something. What do you think I bought? What would you buy? Here we were free. What's the first thing that you would buy? What do you think a 14-year-old boy would buy? Newspaper? No.
Candy.
Candy? No. Well, sort of. One thing I bought was a banana. I never had a banana before. Never had one before. Never had an orange before, for that matter. But bought a banana, and then I bought something that was worth its weight in gold to young people in East Germany. It was little bazooka bubble gum, because bubble gum or any kind of gum was outlawed in East Germany because it was too Western. It was too American. So frequently we would get packages actually from America with bubble gum in it, and I would cut it into quarters, and I could trade that in for almost anything. It was very, very valuable. So I bought some sticks of bubble gum. So those are the first two things I bought. We went upstairs the stairs, and there was a policeman there, and the policeman, my mother asked him where we could go because we just escaped East Germany. And don't forget, this is Christmas Eve now. This is October 24th, 1959. And he pointed us to a fugitive camp, and we went to that fugitive camp, and there must have been 1,000 people, 1,000 people, maybe 500 families with children, and everyone had a little suitcase. That's all they could take. So kind of imagine what you would take if you were to take a trip like that and put it into a little suitcase to avoid any suspicion. There were so many fugitives that there wasn't enough room in the fugitive camp, and we were bused to an old factory. There was a room, and there were about 200 bunk beds. And that's where I spent Christmas Eve that year. I felt sorry for myself. I think I cried myself to sleep. There were no Christmas presents. Uh, the men were snoring like crazy. Children were crying, and mothers were comforting their children. It was pretty noisy until late at night when everyone finally fell asleep. Um, we stayed in that old factory for several months. During that time, my mother had to go, and the heads of household had to go to the main fugitive camp, to fill out paperwork so that we could migrate to West Germany. Um, and there was a bus in the morning that left, several buses actually, that left from that old factory. One day we found out that one of the bus drivers of these heads of households, usually the wives and children stayed behind, the heads of households got on the bus, that one of the bus drivers was paid off by the East Germans. And instead of going to the main fugitive camp, he went back to the east. Soldiers were waiting for them. They emptied the bus and arrested all the heads of household. Luckily, my mother was not on that. But when word came to the factory where we all stayed, I don't think I've ever seen as much anguish. What are the mothers going to do? Are they going to leave their husbands back in the East? Are they going to join them, go back to the East, be punished? What should they do? What about their children? Some mothers had befriended other families, and they gave their oldest children to their friends that they made, hoping that they would take care of them and take them with them to West Germany. And then most of the mothers went back to be with their husbands. They wanted to face whatever situation they might face together with the young children. I don't think I've ever seen as much anguish as I saw that evening in that fugitive camp, in that old factory. About a year later, eventually we made it to West Germany. We were flown there. I got airsick. It was a tiny little airplane, bounced all over the place. But we made it to West Germany, and a year later, we got on a big boat. It was called the MS Berlin. It was one of the last immigrant boats to make it to America. That was our goal. The ocean voyage across the Atlantic would take about 10 days. And for 7 days, we wouldn't see any land. It was quite memorable. And I can remember everything on that ocean voyage. It was pretty spectacular. Around Greenland, we passed Greenland, there was a big storm, and we were told not to come out because the waves were so big, and sure enough, the boat was bouncing all over. We had a cabin way in the bowels of the boat near the anchor, because later on we heard the anchor go down, and it was a little porthole, but we were told to close it because the waves were going to be so big, and there was a metal flap that we could close the glass window over. So it was an interesting passage. Hardly anybody spoke any of the same languages, and us children communicated by sign language and made each other understood. On the 9th day, the captain announced that the following day, if we got up early enough, we might see the Statue of Liberty. So I was really excited to see that, and I wanted to be one of the first to see it. So around maybe 2 or 3 in the morning, I tiptoed up on deck, and I always get a little emotional with this. I tiptoed up on deck, and it was total silence. There was a fog in the air, it was misty, and no one up there. As I worked my way towards the front, I all of a sudden bumped into someone. And I excused myself. And then, as I moved a little further, I bumped into someone else. When I finally got to the front of the boat, instead of being the first person up there, I was probably the last person. Everyone was there. Total silence, holding hands. Looking for that Statue of Liberty. So as time passed, the fog lifted a little, and you could see the torch, and then you could see the entire statue. Not a word was spoken, not a word. People were holding hands. That statue represented freedom and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Eventually we got into New York, the harbor, and we got off the boat. I knew very, very little about America, very little. All I knew was there were Indians and cowboys, and some of the false news that was reported in East Germany about America. Well, instead of all these terrible things that I was told, here there were high rises. There was a big long, as the boat came into the harbor, we saw a big long